Hello everyone, welcome to another watercolor workshop. Today I'm going to be painting a very simple tree landscape. I'm using two colours, yellow benzimidazolone and indigo. Here's a swatch. In a previous video I went into this in more detail. I will link to that below. Basically I'm going to use the blue for the sky and I'm going to mix green for the trees and the ground. On we go with the actual painting, and I'm starting off with the sky. Now I've started on dry paper here. I've got some wet paint coming onto dry. I'm not quite sure why it went wet onto dry. I would normally go wet onto wet for the sky, but never mind. I've started, so I'll finish. And I am just adding plenty of water as I paint along and down towards the horizon. And then once it's all on, I'm going to add some more strength in the colour along the top. Skies tend to be darker the further up we go and lighter towards the horizon. Just tilting the paper there a little bit so the pigment runs down. Now it's still wet. The sky is still wet. I've mixed up a green and I'm painting a line of trees or a line of blobs to represent trees. And you can see that the wet green paint on the wet blue sky creates these little spidery effects which look a bit like foliage, leaves, branches on the top of the tree line. And I repeated this process on the other side. And then I darkened the green by adding some blue and ran it along the bottom of the tree line. So basically, usually when you paint trees, the light comes from above. So the lightest part of the tree is the top, and then the middle part of the tree is a mid-tone, and then the darkest part of the tree is the lowest section. I'm just tilting the paper there again to move those puddles around. Now I'm doing the ground section, and I decided to do this wet onto wet. This is what I should have done for the sky. I'm possibly doing this the wrong way around, i.e. the ground would normally be wet onto dry, but never mind. This is an experiment. I've mixed up a yellowy green and I'm just painting it all very good and really nice, quick and smooth because the paper's wet. Trying not to leave any gaps, but it doesn't really matter if there are a few. There will be an extra layer later on. Now I've got my blue and I'm applying it to the yellow ground area, and obviously it turns into green. So this is wet into wet, and I'm just painting a few stripes to give myself some texture in the foreground. Next I'm applying the tree trunks, and these are pure indigo. Quite wet again. Now the trees are still wet-ish, damp probably, and the ground is still wet, so where the blue touches these areas, there might be a little bit of bleed. There's not much up into the trees, which was a bit disappointing. I obviously didn't work quickly enough. But there is some into the ground area, which gives quite a nice effect, I think. Like that. I quite like that kind of thing. So then I decided I would add some force the issue by adding a little bit of the blue into the tree area myself. Rather than just letting it run up from the trunk, I've had to add it myself. So this is giving me the shading I was talking about. Light at the top, medium tone in the middle and dark along the bottom. That's the basic principle I'm going for. Now I'm trying to add some basic shadow onto the ground area. Again, I'm going with the blue over the green, and it's giving me a bluey green result. So the ground is still very wet, as you can see. And a last little dab of some very wet blue onto wet. That might turn out badly. We might get some blues. Let it dry and see what happens. And yeah, I'm not that happy with that. I quite like the sky. Quite like the top of the tree line. Don't like the ground, so I'm going over the ground now with some very dark bluey green. So if you do get an area and you're not super happy with it, you can paint over it as long. But of course, only if your next colour is darker than the one you started with. If you have an area that's quite dark and you don't like it, it's very hard to paint over it with a light colour unless you use a gouache or something similar, something opaque. Anyway, I'm now touching up the trees again. I thought they were a bit pale. It was obviously very wet and it's dried quite pale. And I'm trying to add some more tone into this area. So I started off with some white paint along the bottom edge and then cleaned my brush and softened the top of the line with some damp water stroke paint. I'm trying to stop a line forming along that top edge. Then I'm dropping in more dark on the bottom. Notice that it looks very dark here because it's wet. But when it dries, it'll be not as dark as we just saw when we got the dried result. So it can be, sometimes it can be a little bit like this, a little bit back and forth. You can never quite predict how your paint is going to dry. Just listing out a few highlights. So basically just dabbing it with a tissue to remove some pigment. And this is totally dry and I wasn't happy with the edge still. So I got a damp tissue and I'm just dabbing it again. This is on a pure and a totally dry paint, and it might even be the next day, just to show that you can actually remove paint even when it's dried on. It's a damp tissue. I'm pressing quite hard. There you go. Lift out dry paint. And the end result. I'm reasonably happy with that. Hope you found that useful. Thank you for watching.